Chapter 4. The Quiet Victims. There are people in every story who never get to speak, not because they have nothing to say, not because their experience is smaller or less significant than the experiences of the people who do speak, but because the architecture of public narrative is not neutral. It is built toward certain voices and away from others. It moves toward the articulate, the prepared, the strategically positioned. It rewards the person who controls the room and ignores the person who has left it. And in the story this book has been examining, a story with multiple platforms, multiple interviews, a global audience, and months of careful public engagement, the architecture has moved with remarkable consistency away from one person in particular. Megan Kerrigan Byron is an educator. She is the Associate Director of the Lower School and Admissions for the Hope Graham Program at Bancroft School in Worcester, Massachusetts, a program supporting students with language-based learning differences. She and Andy Byron have 2 sons. They live or lived in a home in Northborough, Massachusetts. She is, by every account that has been assembled about her from the outside, a private person who did not seek public life, did not build a platform, and had no infrastructure in place for the moment the camera at Gillette Stadium found her husband with his arms around another woman. She found out the way tens of millions of other people found out. From the internet. Not a conversation, not a phone call. Not the kind of private reckoning, however painful, that relationships sometimes require. From the internet, arriving in real time, with a comment section. That is where this chapter begins. Not with the person on the stage, with the person who was not given one. The moment the other screen lit up. On July 16th, 2025, while 70,000 people at Gillette Stadium watched a jumbotron, and while Grace Springer filmed it on her phone and uploaded it to TikTok, and while the clip began its exponential journey across every platform on Earth, somewhere in Massachusetts, a phone screen lit up. It might have been a text from a friend, a link sent with no message, or with a message that tried and failed to soften what it was carrying. It might have been a notification, a news alert, a tag, a comment on a social media account that had not yet been deactivated. It might have been her sons, who according to reports were aware of the situation, coming to find her. However it arrived, the moment arrived, and it arrived all at once, the way these moments always do, not gradually, not with warning, not with the courtesy of preparation. This is one of the specific violences of public exposure that we rarely discuss with the seriousness it deserves. There is a profound difference between discovering something painful in private and discovering it as the rest of the world discovers it simultaneously. Private discovery, however devastating, allows for the basic human dignities of the aftermath. The ability to cry without an audience, to process without performance, to decide who to tell and when and how, to move through the first hours of a new and terrible reality on your own terms. Public discovery removes all of that. It replaces private grief with an instant demand for response, because the moment others know, they begin to have opinions, and those opinions arrive in your direction whether you have invited them or not. It replaces the quiet, careful work of absorbing a shock with the immediate pressure of containment. What do I say? Who is calling? What do I do about the comments? What do my children know? What does this look like from the outside? And what do I need to do right now to protect whatever can still be protected? Megan Kerrigan Byron had to do all of that publicly, having had no time to do any of it privately first. What the Internet did in her name. The Internet, which had rendered its judgment on Kristen Cabot with considerable speed and considerable cruelty, did something equally revealing in the days that followed, It manufactured a voice for Megan Kerrigan Byron because she had not provided one herself. Multiple fake statements circulated in her name within days of the concert. One, fact-checked and debunked by Snopes, purported to show her making an emotional video confession about the betrayal, describing the public humiliation as having cut deeper than anything. The woman in the video did not resemble Megan Kerrigan Byron, but the video spread widely regardless because the audience had a narrative need that reality was not filling. They needed her response. They needed her pain to be visible and documented and quotable, and since she was not providing it, the internet provided it for her. Another fabricated statement circulated on X, Instagram, Threads, and Blue Sky, a stylized, witty, formal statement written in the voice of a woman who had decided to respond to her husband's public betrayal with sharp humor and composed fury. "I am not spiraling. I am ascending." It was widely shared and celebrated. It was also entirely fictitious. Snopes found no evidence it came from Megan, who had by that point removed Byron's surname from her Facebook profile and deactivated her account entirely. This phenomenon, the manufacture of a voice for a silent victim, is worth examining in its own right because it reveals something important about how the internet processes absence. Megan's silence was not respected as a legitimate response. It was treated as a gap to be filled. The audience wanted a reaction, and when none came, they invented several. The invented reactions were then shared, celebrated, sometimes believed, and Megan, who had no platform, no publicist, and no infrastructure for managing any of this, had no effective way to refute them. She was not only denied the right to tell her own story, she was given stories she had not written, attributed with emotions she had not expressed, and placed into a public narrative she had not chosen to enter, all while the actual account of what she was experiencing remained entirely, fiercely private. The geography of retreat. What we know of Megan Kerrigan. Byron's movements in the weeks after July 16th comes from the kind of reporting that tracks people who are trying not to be tracked, and it is worth being careful about what that reporting tells us and what it does not. According to multiple outlets, including the Daily Mail, she left the family home in Northborough, Massachusetts, a property valued at approximately $1.4 million, and relocated to a property in Kennebunk, Maine, described as a $2.4 million, 4,169 square foot home. Friends and family were seen visiting throughout the week. She was, by the accounts available, surrounded by people who loved her and were doing what people who love someone in crisis do, showing up. By September 2025, photographs published by the Daily Mail showed her and Andy Byron together, walking, apparently reconciling, or at least occupying the same space in a way that suggested the story was more complicated than the version the internet had written. By October, reporting indicated they had not filed for divorce. Their marriage, whatever its current state, had not ended. There is a great deal that this book cannot know about what those months looked like from the inside, whether there were conversations that changed things, whether there was forgiveness or the beginning of it, or simply the complex private reckoning that long marriages sometimes require when they have been tested at the very edge of what they can hold. None of that is this book's to know or to judge. What this book can do is note the specific quality of privacy that Megan maintained throughout, a quality that stood in vivid contrast to the volume of public testimony offered by the other central figure in the story. While Kristen Cabot gave 2 major interviews, appeared on Oprah, joined a speaking circuit, and built a platform around the experience of surviving what happened, Megan Kerrigan Byron said nothing, not one public word. She retreated, processed, was photographed from a distance by reporters who had decided her grief was news, and continued living her life as a private person who had been thrust into a public situation without her consent and who was doing everything in her power to remove herself from it. That silence is not absence. It is a form of dignity, and it deserves to be recognized as such. The violence of public exposure. We do not often use the word violence in connection with exposure. It seems like an overstatement. Violence implies physical force, immediate harm, the kind of damage that leaves visible marks. But there is a category of harm that is not physical and not immediately visible and not therefore less real, and public exposure, particularly the kind that arrives without warning, strips away the basic controls that human beings need to manage their own grief and turns private pain into public content, belongs in that category. Consider what was taken from Megan Kerrigan Byron in the hours and days after July 16th. The choice of how to find out, the choice of who to tell first, the choice of how to respond or whether to respond at all, the choice of how to talk to her sons, what to say, in what words, at what moment, the choice of how to grieve privately before anyone asked her to perform that grief publicly, the choice of what her own face and name and life story meant to the world before the world decided it had a right to those things. All of those choices were removed in the 15 seconds it took a Jumbotron camera to find two people at a Coldplay concert. Not because anyone intended to harm her. Grace Springer filmed a funny moment, Coldplay's camera crew did what cameras do, and the internet amplified what it always amplifies, but intention is not the measure of harm. Impact is, and the impact on Megan Kerrigan Byron was that her private life became global content before she had had a single moment to absorb what it meant. The comments on the posts that went viral were, many of them, sympathetic to her. People sent her solidarity. Strangers told her she deserved better. Others told her to take him for everything. This sympathy was real, and in its own way generous, but it also added to the volume of noise she had not asked to be surrounded by. Sympathy from strangers, when you have not invited it, is still an intrusion. It still requires that you exist in relation to a story you did not choose to be part of. It still places you in the position of a character in a narrative that belongs to other people. And that is a position that no amount of warmth from the audience makes comfortable. Two sons. The reporting on Megan Kerrigan Byron mentions in passing that she and Andy Byron have two sons. In passing. As background detail. Context for the picture of the family that exists alongside the picture of the Jumbotron. But two sons are not background detail. They are people. They are, depending on their ages, young men or boys who one day in July 2025 discovered something about their father that no child should have to discover from the internet. Who had to go to school the next day or the day after in a world where their family name had become a trending topic? Who had to navigate conversations with friends and classmates and teachers that would not have been easy to navigate under any circumstances and were made specifically unnavigable by the fact that the story was everywhere and the context was nowhere. Children absorb disruption not through headlines, but through the specific texture of daily life. They feel it in the silence at the dinner table that replaced whatever the dinner table used to sound like. They feel it in the tension that adults believe they are concealing, but children have always known how to read. They feel it in the way routines change, in the shift of a parent's attention, in the careful sentences that are said in place of the honest ones. They feel it when they search their own name online, or their father's name, or their mother's name, and find the internet has opinions about all of them. Kristen Cabot spoke at length, in both interviews, about the impact of the events on her children, her teenage children's fear, her inability, in the darkest period, to be present as a parent, the death threats that made her children afraid she was going to die. These things are real, and they matter, and they were right to be named. But Byron's sons were never named, never acknowledged, never made present in the public account as people who were also in this story, also absorbing its weight, also being shaped by events they did not choose. They existed, as their mother existed, in the silence on the other side of the microphone. And the silence was not because their experience was smaller, it was because no one invited them into the room. The weight of silence. Silence is widely misread as absence, as the sign that there is nothing there, no experience, no depth, no story worth attending to. In a media environment that equates volume with importance and visibility with significance, the person who does not speak is easily forgotten. Their story recedes not because it is over, but because it has no platform from which to be told. But silence can be full. It can be full of processing that is too painful to perform, full of decisions made carefully and quietly, away from an audience, full of a kind of dignity that the noise of public narrative does not leave room for, full of love, the specific, unglamorous, unviralizable love of people who show up with food and sit with someone in a kitchen in Maine and do not need to post about it. Megan Kerrigan Byron's silence has been full in this sense. The family and friends who visited her in Kennebunk were not there for the content. The conversations she had with her sons were not recorded. The decisions she made about her marriage, whatever those decisions were, whatever shape the relationship has or has not returned to, were made in private, without a speaking circuit, without an Oprah interview, without a platform for changing narratives. She simply lived it. And that kind of living, without amplification, without sympathy, redirected toward her by the architecture of the story, without the protection of narrative, that kind of living is harder than it looks from the outside, because the person who does not speak still has to carry the weight of everything that was said. She still has to exist in a world where the version of events that circulates is the one that was given a platform. She still has to read or hear about or navigate the fact that the woman who was closest to her husband has been on Oprah talking about her own suffering, and that in hours of public testimony, Megan's name was never spoken. What that costs, to be the unspoken name in someone else's account of events that most directly affected you, is not calculable, but it is real, and it is one of the deepest costs of the story this book is examining. The Educator Who Became a Headline. There is something worth sitting with in the specific detail of what Megan Kerrigan Byron does for a living. She is an educator. She works with children who have language-based learning differences, children who struggle precisely with communication, with the gap between what they understand and what they can express, with the experience of having something inside them that they cannot yet get out in the form the world will receive. She has built a professional life around helping people find their voice, around creating the conditions in which communication becomes possible for those for whom it has been difficult, around the quiet, unglamorous, deeply important work of being present for people who are struggling to be understood. And then, in July 2025, she became a person who could not speak, not because she lacked the capacity, but because the world had decided what her voice should say before she had had any opportunity to say it. The fake statements, the manufactured quotes, the viral videos of women who were not her, credited to her, spreading her imagined grief across the internet. She became, briefly, the character the story needed her to be, rather than the person she actually was. And the actual person, the educator in Worcester who helps children find their words, had no mechanism for correcting the record that the internet would accept. There is no satisfying symmetry to draw from this. It is simply one of the specific ironies that reality produces without caring about narrative elegance. But it is worth noting because it makes concrete something that is easy to say abstractly. The quiet victims of these moments are not abstract. They are specific people with specific lives doing specific work in the world. And the moment the Jumbotron finds someone they love, all of that specificity is dissolved into the needs of a story that was never really about them. There is no clean break. Public discourse about separation, infidelity, and the end of relationships has a tendency toward the neat, toward the language of closure and moving forward and clean breaks, toward narratives in which the wound is clean and the healing is directional and the person who was wronged emerges, eventually, into something that can be described as okay. Real relationships do not move like this. They are woven into families, into routines, into identities, into the specific accumulated fabric of a life that two people have built together, which does not unravel cleanly when something breaks within it. Andy and Megan Byron had been together long enough to have built a home in Northborough, to have raised 2 sons, to have constructed the kind of life that has particular textures and particular histories and particular irreplaceable rhythms. When the Jumbotron found them on July 16th, what it disrupted was not just a marriage. It was all of that: the home, the sons, the routines, the private language that long partnerships develop and that cannot be replaced by starting over. Even when relationships end, even when separation is the right decision and is handled with as much care as can be managed, those things do not simply cease to exist. They transform. They become the shared history that former partners navigate around, especially when children are involved. They become the texture of a life that has been altered rather than ended. Because the past does not end, it simply becomes fixed, and the people who lived in it must now figure out how to live in relation to something that was once present and is now only memory. The reports of Andy and Megan Byron being seen together in September and October 2025, walking in Maine, apparently not having filed for divorce, are not a resolution. They are evidence that real relationships are more complicated than the narratives constructed around them. That forgiveness, or its attempt, or even simply the shared recognition of 2 people who have built a life together that they are not ready to dismantle. None of that is simple, and none of it moves in a straight line, and none of it needs to be resolved in public to be valid. What it does need, and what it has not consistently received, is the basic respect of not being narrated by people who were not in the room. The unseen narrative. In every public story of this kind, the viral moment, the corporate scandal, the celebrity exposure, one narrative rises above the others, the one that is told, the one that has a platform and a structure and an audience and a person willing to occupy the center of it. This narrative does not erase the others. It simply makes them inaudible. And inaudible is, for all practical purposes, the same as invisible. But beneath the told narrative, the others continue, quieter, less structured, less controlled, less equipped with the language of media management and the infrastructure of public explanation. They unfold in kitchens in Maine, in conversations about what to tell 2 sons and how and when, in the decisions a woman makes when she walks back into a school in Worcester on a Monday morning, knowing that some of the parents of the children she works with will have seen the Jumbotron video, will have seen her name in the headlines, and will have formed opinions about her life that she did not invite and cannot correct. They unfold in the specific private work of deciding what a marriage means after something like this, and whether it can mean what it meant before and what it means if it cannot. In the long, uneven process of figuring out how to move forward when forward has not yet been defined. None of this makes it into the interviews. None of it trends. None of it is content. And because it is not content, it is not, by the logic of the media environment, seen to be happening. But it is happening. It is happening in ways that are not small and not temporary and not separable from the public story that has been told around them. The private narrative and the public narrative are not two different stories. They are two halves of the same one. And a story told with only one of its halves is, by definition, incomplete. Empathy has direction. One of the most powerful forces in any public narrative is empathy. Where it goes, how it flows, who it finds. And empathy, in the context of a story with a clear central speaker and a clear narrative structure, follows visibility with almost gravitational consistency. It moves toward the person who is speaking, the person who is explaining, the person whose face we can see and whose voice we can hear, and whose pain we have been given the language to understand. This is not a failure of the people feeling empathy. It is a structural feature of how narrative works. We empathize more readily with what we can access, and access is controlled by visibility, and visibility is controlled by platform, and platform is controlled by the specific, unequal distribution of resources and choices and circumstances that determined who ended up on a stage and who ended up in a kitchen in Maine. The women who watched the Oprah interview and felt, instinctively, that something was missing, that the empathy was being directed toward the wrong center or toward an incomplete version of the center, were not being cruel. They were doing something that our architecture of narrative does not always make easy. They were insisting that empathy does not have to stop at the edge of visibility, that it can extend toward people who are not speaking, that the person who is most silent in a story is not therefore the person who is least affected. Extending empathy toward the invisible is harder than extending it toward the visible. It requires imagination rather than just attention. It requires the willingness to ask actively who is not in this room and what might their experience be, and does the story I am being told account for them? It is a discipline, not a reflex. And it is the discipline this chapter is attempting to practice. Because Megan Kerrigan Byron is not a symbol. She is not a narrative device. She is not the wronged wife, a character deployed to complicate the sympathetic account of the woman who spoke. She is a specific person with a specific life, doing specific and valuable work in the world, who had that life disrupted in public without her consent, and who has navigated the disruption with a dignity that has not been sufficiently acknowledged precisely because it was quiet. She deserves to be named, not as a function of someone else's story, as a person in her own right. The cost that does not go viral. The most significant costs of what happened on July 16, 2025, do not appear in any set of search results. They do not trend. They do not circulate. They are not content. They are the conversations that had to happen in the Byron household about what the boys had seen and what it meant and what was going to happen next. They are the professional awkwardness of an educator returning to a school where she works with children whose families now know her name in a context she did not choose. They are the specific grief of looking at photographs on a Facebook profile, still showing the couple happily together before it was deactivated, and deciding what to do with them. They are the question of what to tell the children about what happened and how much is appropriate, and what version of the truth is both honest enough to respect them and careful enough not to burden them with what they cannot yet carry. They are the rebuilding of trust. If trust is being rebuilt, in the specific, incremental, unspectacular way that trust is rebuilt, not in a conversation, but in hundreds of small moments that accumulate over months and years and that have no narrative equivalent because they are not narratable. They are the redefinition of a relationship, whatever form that takes, staying or leaving or something that does not have a clean name, in real time, without a roadmap, in a world that has strong opinions about what should happen and no access to what is actually happening. These costs are not less real because they are invisible. They are, in many ways, more real because they are lived rather than performed, carried rather than spoken, present in every ordinary moment rather than only in the extraordinary ones that make it onto a stage. They simply do not go viral. And in a world that measures significance by virality, that makes them easy to miss. It does not make them small. Recentering the story. This chapter has been arguing through the accumulation of specific detail rather than through abstract principle for a shift in how the story of the Coldplay concert and its aftermath is understood. The shift is not from sympathy to judgment. It is not from Cabot as victim to Cabot as villain. It is not a reassignment of moral categories that replaces one simple account with another. The shift is from a story with one center to a story with several, from a narrative in which one person's experience of the events is the primary experience and everyone else exists as context, to a narrative in which the people who were most structurally affected, the people who had no platform, no preparation, no narrative infrastructure, are also present as centers of the account rather than as its margins. This shift requires acknowledging that attention is not the same as importance, that the person who spoke at greatest length and on the most prominent platforms is not necessarily the person who carries the greatest weight, that the invisible costs, the ones that do not trend, the ones that unfold in kitchens and schools and difficult family conversations, are costs, and that they belong in any serious accounting of what the 15 seconds at Gillette Stadium actually meant. Megan Kerrigan Byron. 2 sons whose names this book does not have. A family that had its private life made public without consent and has navigated the consequences in private, as privately as possible, for 8 months and counting. They did not choose the moment. They were not in the VIP section. They did not make the decisions that led to the camera finding 2 people in an embrace that was never meant to be seen. And yet they carry the weight of it, quietly, invisibly, in the way that people who are not given platforms always carry the weight of stories that are told about them without them. Until the story includes them, not as context, not as consequence, but as people, the story remains incomplete. And a story that knows it is incomplete and tells itself anyway, as though the missing parts are a detail rather than the center, is not honesty. It is something else entirely.